Here's a frosty winter scene with a simple color palette that you can easily paint in Procreate. In today's video, I'll show you how to make this forest scene with very little sketching or planning, then I'll show you how to improve your colors, and finally how to paint a simple character. As usual, you can follow this with any brushes you're comfortable with, but I'll list the brushes I'm using here in the description right next to the like button. Now before I start painting, I need to make a really simple sketch. So I'm going to grab my sketching pencil brush here, and I'm going to make a rectangle that roughs out the overall shape of the illustration. And then up here in the background, I'm going to sketch out some hills as well. Next, I'm going to make a blank layer. I'm going to put it underneath my sketch, and I'm going to lower the transparency of my sketch so I can barely see it. Then continuing on this blank layer, I'm going to fill out the background using this very light bluish gray tone, the abstract round, and I'm just going to do a loose wash like this. Then to smooth this out just a little bit, I'm going to change to the water blender brush and carefully soften some of these overlapping strokes. Next, I'm going to move on and do the hills up here in the background. So for those, I'm going to do it on a separate blank layer. For this hill here, I'm going to use a slightly darker kind of version of my blue tone, and I'll rough it out with the abstract round. After that, I'll grab the eraser brush, which is set to the fine liner pen, and I'll use it to kind of cut it back so it follows the sketch better. Now for the sky, I'm going to do a similar thing, just with a different brush. So I'll make another blank layer, kind of a similar darker blue tone, but this time I'm going to switch to a charcoal brush, the 6B compressed, and I'm going to use that to fill in the sky with this scratchy texture. And also just like before, I'm going to use the eraser brush to cut it back. And I think I'm happy with the kind of darkness of this hill, but the sky looks a little bit too dark, so I'm going to lower the opacity of the sky layer. There we go. And once I'm happy with everything so far, I'm going to merge those 3 layers together onto one. And at this point, I can move on and start painting those tall trees in the foreground. And those are going to be on their own layer, so make a layer above the background. I'm going to use a few different shades of this same blue tone, but I'm going to go back to the watercolor set and use the abstract round. And I'm going to rough just one tree out. And I want these trees to have a lot of texture, so I'm going to switch back to the charcoal brush and use the 6B compressed again, changing the color a few times, and just adding this texture all over it. There we go. And overall, I tried to add the texture in such a way that the right side of the trunk is a little bit darker than the left side, but it doesn't have to be perfectly consistent. Next, I'm going to switch back to the eraser brush, and I'm going to use it to kind of clean up the edges here. So I'll just do a long stroke, hold the position at the end until Procreate snaps it, and this is how I'll get a straight edge. I'm also going to use the eraser at a little bit of a smaller size and use it to round out the base of the trunk. And it's optional, but I like to add a dark line along the edge of the trunk. So to do that, I recommend going to the drawing brush tab here and using the little pine brush and a very, very dark version of our blue tone, and just going along the edge like this. Now this scene basically has just 4 trees and they're all the same, so I'm just going to duplicate this tree to make them all. But first, I'm going to position this one a little bit better. There we go. Then I'll duplicate the layer. Air tool again, set to freeform. I'll shrink it and scale it so it looks a little bit smaller and further away. And I'll position it over here. And I'm just going to repeat this process for all the trees. After that, I'm going to individually adjust the brightness and contrast of each of the 4 trees so they look slightly different. And after that, I'm going to merge all 4 trees together onto one layer, and then I want to add some little twigs and branches, and I recommend doing that again with the little pine brush in the drawing tab. And I think it's important to keep in mind with this whole illustration that stuff closer to us is generally bigger, and as we're going further away, we're trying to make them smaller. Now at this point, these trees are pretty much finished, but they're basically going vertical, and to make them more interesting, I want to skew them a little bit to the left. So to do that, I'm going to make sure the layer with the twigs and the trees is selected. I'll grab the arrow tool, set to distort, and I'll just zoom out and lean them like this. And once I'm completely happy with how the trees look and the position of them, I can finally start working on the shadows. So for that, I'll make a blank layer, and I'm going to make sure it's below the trees. I'll use another one of these kind of medium blue grays. I'll switch back to the watercolor kit and use the abstract round, and I'm just going to draw on all the shadows like this. And even though there's only 4 trees that we can see, I'm assuming there's more trees over here that are also casting shadows, so I'll draw some shadows for those as well. And these shadows might be a little bit too dark, and that's why I drew them on their own layer. So I'm going to change the transparency mode of the shadow layer to multiply. Then I can set the opacity so they're not too visible, but they're still pretty bold. Now this next detail I want to add here is very optional. I want to add some clusters of trees at the base of this hill. So to do that, I'll make another blank layer, but I'm going to move it below the trees and below the shadows for the trees, just above the background. For the color, I'll use a pretty dark blue tone. I'm going to go back to the watercolor kit and use the abstract round again, but at a pretty small size. And I'm just going to draw on some kind of clusters of trees like this. After that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush again, which is still set to the fine liner pen, and I'm going to use it to roughly flatten out the bottom of each cluster of trees. And this kind of abstract detail is very tough if you're a perfectionist, but I promise it really is as easy as it looks, and I wouldn't get too carried away trying to make it perfect. And at this point, with all the major elements for the landscape scene here painted in, I want to clean up the edges. So to do that, I'm going to select all the layers at the same time, including the top one here, which is the sketch, and I'm going to use the arrow tool, set to freeform, and I'm just going to move this off the edge just until I see the kind of edge of the sketch. I'll deselect it, select it again, and you can see it's just kind of clipped that off, and I'm going to do that against all sides using the sketch as my guide. The next thing I want to show you is also somewhat optional. I want to explain how to improve all the colors and make them kind of more harmonious. But in order to do that, I need to merge everything together onto one layer. So if I open the layers panel, here's everything, and the top one here is the sketch. And I actually don't need the sketch at all anymore, so I'm just going to delete it. And then I'll pinch and merge all the other layers together onto one. After that, I'm going to go to my adjustments and tap on gradient map. And you can see in the gradient library, we've got a lot of options. I recommend using Mocha, the one at the end, and yours is going to look different than mine because I've already adjusted the colors, but it should still have 5 evenly spaced color options. And the first thing I recommend doing is kind of double checking and making sure that they're very evenly spaced. There we go. After that, I'm going to go through each one and fix the brightness. So this one here at the end needs to be at 100% brightness. And I think it's easier to adjust this if we change our kind of view mode here over to the double lines. This lets us see the color numbers. So since this box here is at the end, it needs to be at 100% brightness. And then I'm also going to set the saturation to 0. Don't worry about the color for now. This one, I won't mess with the saturation, but I'm going to set the brightness to 75%. And that's because it's basically 75% of the way to the end. This one here is in the middle, so I'm going to adjust it to about 50%. This one here is a quarter of the way, so this will be 25%. And this one at the very beginning will be at 0. So just imagine a scale here of 0 to 100, and these are kind of given evenly spaced percentages of that brightness. And once we've sorted out the brightness, we can go through and adjust the hue of each one to be a different shade of indigo. And just make sure the one at the end has the saturation set to 0 because we don't want the highlights to be anything other than white. There we go. I think all this looks pretty good. And once you're happy with the colors, just tap on the screen to get rid of that color panel. Click Done, and then you can tap on the adjustments to go back to the regular Procreate painting mode. And this is definitely a little bit of work to do, so here's a comparison of how it looks like before I did this with how it looks like afterwards, and you can judge for yourself if you think it's worth the effort. And now to kind of finish up this background scene, I want to add some blowing snow. So I'm going to make a blank layer above it. I'm going to use pure white. I'll go back to the watercolor brushes, and I'm going to use this stippling brush at the top, and I'll just go over it like this. And finally, we can move on and paint the person. And he's going to be on his own layer above everything, even above the snow. And I want to rough out a kind of silhouette of him first. So for that, I'm going to use a light skin tone. For the brush, I'm going to use the smooth round brush at a pretty small size. And I'm going to start by drawing a kind of bell shape. After that, I'll draw his feet, basically just straight out. Then his hands kind of at his sides. And then his head like this. And since this character is walking away from us, his posture is pretty simple. I just want to bend his leg a little bit. So to do that, I'm going to grab the freehand selection tool. I'm just going to select that leg. I'll tip it like that, and then I'll select it again, but this time just at the knee, and I'll bend it back. And that's pretty much all you need to do to make this character look right. And once this silhouette is finished and his posture looks good, I'm going to move on and just continue on this same layer, just using the fine liner pen to loosely add kind of all his clothes and backpack and snow gear. And this often happens, but once I've added all these details and clothes, I can tell his legs are a little bit too short. So all I have to do to fix that is just use the warp tool to stretch it out a little bit. Next, I'll position and scale him a little bit better in the scene, and then I'll make a new layer above him, and this is where I'm going to draw his footprints. So I recommend using a kind of a dark blue tone. For the brush, you can use any brush. I think the fine liner is fine. And I'm actually just going to do kind of one line of steps first, and as they come closer to us, they're getting a little bit bigger and a little bit further apart. Then I'll go back and do the alternating steps. And it's optional, but the last thing I'm going to do is kind of dress the edge. This is something I do in a lot of my videos, and all I'm doing is just making another blank layer above everything and just painting on white so it covers the edges and makes them a little bit softer and rounder. And there we go, our illustration is all done. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you want to learn more about painting simple landscapes like this, I think you'll love to watch one of these two videos next.